Hello everyone and welcome to today's Carbon Footprint webinar from LRQA. My name is Louise Hollings. I'm one of the marketing managers at LRQA for the UK and Ireland, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. This webinar is being recorded and we'll share a link with everyone who's registered in the coming days. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the question pane of the control panel. You can send your questions in at any time during the presentation and we'll collect these and go through as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. We'll also be running some polls today. Please note that the responses are anonymous and that the results will be shared only as a percentage on the screen. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Olga Rivas. Olga has 25 years experience advising and auditing businesses on environmental, energy, and health and safety risks, as well as helping organizations to drive culture change. She's participated in verification projects for sustainability reports and non-financial information with a variety of large brands. Prior to this role, Olga worked as a consultant, trainer, and auditor in environmental, energy, health and safety management systems, and provided assessment and verification services for greenhouse gas emissions and other sustainability data, ISO 14001 and social auditing schemes, as well as various roles with LRQA related to management training of auditors and verifiers and leading complex verifications. Next, we have Bethan Hutchison, who's a Senior Carbon Reduction Advisor at Mott MacDonald, with 5 years of carbon management experience spanning across the corporate, consulting and contracting landscapes. In her current position, Bethan focuses on delivering Mott MacDonald's carbon reduction plan, including ensuring alignment to ISO 14064, which is annually verified across the global organisation. Bethan understands the challenges and the journey of implementing standards across a multinational organisation. We look forward to hearing from you later, Bethan. Welcome. Unfortunately, Alicia is unable to join us today, so our final speaker today will be Daniel Carmel, who's an aerospace and defence expert with a background at companies like Rolls-Royce and MBDA Systems, who now brings his expertise to LRQA. His focus includes developing business strategies, enhancing infrastructure and operational efficiency, and leading consultancy projects for aerospace and defence clients. Daniel regularly contributes to leading publications like Aerospace Manufacturing, Engineering Materials, and Flight Global. Great to have you with us today, Daniel.
Thank you.
So before we get started, it would be useful for our experts to get a better understanding of our audience today. So we have a quick poll question for you. So we'd like to know, where is your organisation in its carbon footprint journey? Are you curious about carbon footprint measurement? Are you in the early stages of implementation? Are you calculating your emissions and carbon footprint? Are you preparing for reporting and verification? You're at the stage of implementing actions to reduce, manage and mitigate your carbon footprint. So just to give you those options again. Are you curious about carbon footprint measurement? Are you at the early stages of implementation? Are you calculating your emissions and carbon footprint? Are you preparing for reporting and verification? Or are you at this stage of implementing actions to reduce, manage and mitigate your carbon footprint? So we see that the responses are just coming through now. Okay, so we have quite a split here. So to our panelists, do you have any comments on that? What do you make of those? Quite a spread there.
From my side, I think that curiosity is only increasing as more and more legislations and directives require the supply chain in any industry, particularly the heavy industries, but they require more transparency about footprints and emissions throughout their supply chain. So curiosity is only bound to increase. So I'm not surprised at seeing that come out on top.
Great, thank you, Daniel. So we'll now hand over to Olga to get us started on today's presentation. Thank you, everybody.
Good afternoon, first of all, and welcome to all the participants that in this webinar. In this session, we would like to provide practical insights into the methodology of carbon footprint calculation, specifically addressing different frameworks, standards, and the verification process. Now, let's outline the 3 key points of these sessions. First, we will overview the climate change reporting landscape, which is marked by numerous reporting standards, goals, and frameworks, and we emphasize the importance of gaining an overview of this, ensuring you have a single source of truth prior to commencing monitoring and disclosing the information. The second point will be diving in the scope 3. We'll look at this critical aspect to provide a complete carbon footprint to the stakeholders. And at least we will go into the LRQA verification process, as this process enhances the credibility of your carbon footprint data. So in the next slide, let's go to the first point, which involves achieving a holistic view of your goals, frameworks, standards, and also sectorial standards prior to commencing to disclose of climate change-related data and information. Let's start with the goals. Many companies have committed to aligning with the Paris Agreement's goal of keeping the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees centigrade. So, for example, become a member of initiatives like the Science-Based Target Initiative is of great interest, as it guides and supports companies in setting and achieving ambitious greenhouse emissions reductions goals aligned with climate science. If we move into the frameworks, we must take in account frameworks related to climate change and also to ESG. Due to in these sustainability frameworks, we have to report also climate change information, so we have to consider. One of the most interesting climate change frameworks is CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. These data are used by investors to assess the environmental performance and risk of these organizations. This information, the information included in CDP, shall be verified in ISO 14064 Part 1, and I would like to remind that LRQA is a partner of CDP for this accredited verification. In relation to the standards, we possess a collection of highly valuable ISO standards that include requirements for quantifying, monitoring organizations, products, carbon neutrality, and specifically for sectors. And we have good past standards that offering essential guidelines and requirements to help us achieve our decarbonization objectives using the most effective tools. If we go to the next slide, going deep on this regarding the ISO 40060 and past families, they provide clarity and consistency for quantifying and monitoring, reporting, and verifying GHG emissions and removals, as well as carbon neutrality. Most companies start with organizational inventories, and for this, ISO 14064 Part 1 and also the GHG protocol are very good standards to work on that. ISO 14064 are requirements, and GHG protocol offers guidelines. In relation to products, we have ISO 14067 and the PAS 2050, and they define the principles, requirements, and guidelines for quantifying the carbon footprint of products associated with a product's life cycle stages, from resource extraction and raw material sourcing and production, use, and end-of-life states. One example, for example, the automotive sector has committed by the 2037 to sell only carbon neutral cars. This means that the car is electric and also that all the parts of the cars, including, for example, the lubricants, are zero emissions too. For these reasons, the suppliers of automotive sector are in a race to decrease the emissions of their parts, and they use ISO 14067 for this purpose. The two standards, I mean the 64 Part 1 and the 67s, are for quantification, as you can see here in the slide, and taking account the life cycle analysis, but in different concepts. In the case of the ISO 14067, is in the conception of the calculation that is based in the life cycle analysis. And in the case of the ISO 14064 Part 1, is including the scope 3 emissions. For carbon neutrality, we have the PAS 2060 and the ISO 14068 we will have in this November. It is forecast that it will be approved in this month. And they are, both of them are specifications for carbon neutrality. And if we talk about the sectors, about the specific sectors, we have, for example, the ISO 14083 for quantification of logistic and transport with a high level of granularity, and the PAS 2080 that is designed for building and infrastructure, as Bethan explained before. One of the characteristics of the PAS 2080 is that includes some governance requirements and is more similar to a certification of the management system, because we are looking not only to data and information, we are looking to these capabilities that more than a verification of the performance. If we go to the next slide, we can explore the scope 3 emissions and what the challenges are for companies to measure and manage. As a quick reminder, scope 3 emissions are those indirect emissions that occur in the value chains of a reporting company, but are not owned or controlled by that company. This includes a broad spectrum of activities in the value chains, such as emissions from the supply chains, transportation of goods, and the use of products by customers. It's important to note that the scope 3 emissions account for a significant percentage of an organization's total emissions, and companies that either do not report or imprecisely report scope 3 emissions risk presenting an incomplete and less credible view of their overall environmental impact. Now let's consider the challenges associated with scope 3 emissions. One major challenge is data availability and data quality. Imagine that your 10%, the 10% of your scope 3 emissions are attributed to the purchasing and transport of a specific raw material. To address this, you will need to gather data from various sources within your organization, such as extracting quantities of raw materials from the ERM database and determining the distance from the sites where they are produced. And how do you approach this complex task? The ISO 40060 family emphasized the need of greater accuracy in sources with the largest volume and those where actionable reductions are possible. Essentially, achieving high accuracy in data from sources with significant emissions not only enhances reporting precision, but also presents opportunity for impactful reduction strategies. Additionally, you could need from your suppliers, including the emission factor of this key raw material. So it is usual to establish long-term collaboration with these suppliers, as they could give you also the emission factor of this raw material, and of course, this data should be credible and verified. At least, let's go in the next slide with the verification process. And in relation with the verification process, we have good news. The verification process is always the same, independent of the standard that we use. The verification process consists of two fundamental stages. Stage 1, known as strategic review and risk assessment, and stage 2, which is the verification process itself. In stage 1, the lead verifier will begin by conducting a strategic review of the client's inventory or information to be verified, starting with a helicopter view to understand all its characteristics and controls that the organization is applying to provide the required information. Subsequently, the verifier will identify risks associated with this information to prepare a sampling plan. This plan identifies the sample and tests to be conducted to verify that the information is complete, accurate, coherent, and the main objective, that is credible. And the stage 2 involves the execution of the mentioned plan. The result is a report with some observation, improvements, and findings, and an assurance statement that provides the credibility by the verified data or information. So, resuming, how can an organization build the trust that is requested? As we say in the beginning, prior to measure, you should clearly identify your goals, frameworks, and standards that will be more relevant for the voluntary and mandatory requirements of your stakeholders. It is very important that you do not report different information for the different schemes or frameworks. To gain this credibility, you need a unique source of trust. It is very interesting to cover the expectations of your stakeholders to report the scope 3, as there is in many cases a significant proportion of your emissions. And at the last point, independent assurance is the key, because you can demonstrate internally and externally your performance and gain the trust of the stakeholders. So thank you. And now I'd like to hand over to my colleagues.
So hi everybody, I'm Bethan Hutchinson. I'm a Senior Carbon Reduction Advisor at Mott MacDonald. So I'm going to be explaining a little bit about our experiences at Mott around ISO 14064 and past 2080 to date. If I could have the next slide, please. So just for some background, Mott MacDonald is a global engineering, management and development consultancy which operates across many different sectors. As well as our consulting business, we also have a contracting arm of the business which operates solely in the UK. But as an organisation, we're firmly committed to carbon reduction. Our net zero targets were validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative earlier this year, which is something that we're really proud of as an organisation. So our science-based targets are made up of 4 different elements. So we have 3 near-term carbon reduction targets. Our first one is for our Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and this is to reduce our emissions by 46.2% by 2030 from a 2019 base year. So we selected 2019 as our base year, as that's the most recent business as usual since pre-COVID. We have 2 near-term Scope 3 emissions. So we have an absolute emissions reduction from fuel and energy related activities, waste, business travel and employee commute by 28% within that same time frame. For all of our other Scope 3 emissions that weren't just mentioned, they're covered by a supplier engagement target, and this is to have 70% of our suppliers by spend to have science-based targets by 2027. We then have a long-term science-based target, which is to reduce all emissions across Scopes 1, 2 and 3 by 90% by 2040. We have a handful of other climate-related commitments which are displayed on the screen. 2 of those are related to the maintenance and annual verification for both ISO 14064 and also past 2080, and we'll be discussing those in more detail in the following slides. On the next Slide, please. We'll just explain how we've designed and started to implement our group carbon reduction plan to help achieve meeting our target. So I'm just going to briefly walk you through this plan from right to left. So on the right, you can see just a brief summary of the science-based targets that we just discussed. And the bars visually show what we hope to achieve and by when relating to those targets. Our plan's made up of three key pillars to help target different sorts of emissions that you can see in the centre of the screen. So first of all, we have behaviour change. So we're looking into how we can encourage our colleagues to travel in lower carbon ways. So for example, earlier this year, we made a recent change to make all mainland Britain flights out of policy on our travel programme. We also have an element around low carbon procurement. So we're looking into how we can engage with our suppliers and also rethinking the processes and procedures that we have in place internally to help reduce the carbon impact of our purchased goods and services. As you can see by the purple part of the bar chart, this is a significant source of where our emissions lie. And the third one is around transition to low carbon energy. So we're currently exploring the use of transition fuels such as hydrotreated vegetable oil within our construction business, and also moving towards electrification wherever that's possible, such as moving towards heating and electrification of heating within our offices. So to the left, this is where we really set out our overarching commitments, and this really highlights that ISO 14064 verification really stands at the heart of our carbon reduction plan, and there are two key reasons for this. So first of all, we want to gain the confidence to ensure that we're actually correctly tracking and monitoring progress against our science-based targets. And second of all, carbon reduction is becoming increasingly more important to both our colleagues but also our clients. So we hope that undertaking ISO 14064 really shows that we're taking this matter seriously, but also that it provides the confidence needed externally on the numbers that we're reporting, especially with the increasing scrutiny businesses are facing around Scope 3 emissions and the current uncertainties that are associated with those. Could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just around our experience of both ISO 14064 and PAS 2080, we started our ISO 14064 journey in 2015, and this is when we undertook our first verification of our UK emissions. And this really helped us gain confidence in our methodology that we were using to calculate our footprint. It also enabled us to test this process by using just our UK business as a pilot in the initial stages. So then in 2019, we started this process again. This time we had a completely new team involved in the footprinting, and we'd also had the recent updates to our carbon reduction targets through the SBTi. It made sense for us at this point to begin verification of ISO 14064 again and see what we could learn from that for our following years. So we're happy to say that since 2019, we have been undertaking this verification on an annual basis. And it's been quite an evolving journey, as you could probably see by the slide. So in 2020, we conducted ISO again, but this time due to the impact of COVID-19, we expanded the scope of what was included in our verification to include greenhouse gas protocol category 7, so the impact of employee commuting and teleworking, just to recognise what impact was having as a result of working from home, for example. Then in 2021, we expanded the scope again. So this time we included our contracting business, which we report internally as MMBC. So MMBC had previously been reporting their emissions separately. We really wanted to move towards holistic group level reporting at that point. Then in 2022, for the first time, we expanded the scope of our ISO verification to include all of those emissions that I've just discussed previously, to align with the new scope of our scope and boundaries of our science-based targets. So this included for the first time full scope for emissions, including purchased goods and services. And then if we move on to the next slide, we can see that we've been on a bit of a similar journey with regard to PAS 2080. So as a company, we've been involved with certification to PAS 2080 since 2017. We were co-authors of the original version of the standard, which was published in 2016. And we're really proud as an organisation to have been involved with the authorship of this standard, which addresses some fundamental challenges that the industry is facing around carbon reduction. So we were the first consultancy within the UK to be certified to pass 2080 back in 2017. So after learning from the findings of doing this for 2 years for our UK business, in 2020 we decided to move towards global certification. We've continued global certification ever since then. Earlier this year, as many of you might be aware, a new version of the PAS was published. Mott MacDonald again was part of the authorship team of the standard, but it really was more of an industry effort to update the standard in line with what's needed now at an industry level. So really bringing in concepts surrounding net zero and surrounding systems thinking. A key part of this update was also to bring together the infrastructure and building sector. So we're quite happy to announce that we were certified globally to the 2023 update of the specification earlier this year, and we're really looking forward to maintaining the certification in many years to come. So we can move on to the final slide. Obviously, having been through this process for several years now, we'd really like to share some of the key lessons that we've learned along the way. So the first one is really just to be prepared. So at Mott, we tend to produce a slide deck and an evidence pack summarising our progress against each of the different clauses within the standards and specifications prior to the audit starts to commence. And we found that this really helps us to identify any gaps that we can start to address. It also helps us to recognise all of the achievements we've made in that year as well. And we've also found that developing very clear method statements, particularly when we're talking about ISO 14064, it can really help the verification run smoothly and also alleviate any errors that might be found. So the second one is around leadership support. So leadership buy-in is really important to help secure the trajectory that you really need for your carbon reduction journey and to get the most out of your verification process as well, so implementing the findings that may occur from the process. It's obviously really important that the whole organisation is familiar with what you're trying to achieve and how they play a part in that. So colleagues seeing that this is really being taken seriously amongst the senior leaders within the company helps with really developing and enabling a carbon reduction culture. So one thing that we've always found useful in our verification is to set up conversations between our auditors and the senior leadership members of the organisation right from the offset of the verification process. So the auditor can really hear firsthand about how we're doing this within the business. So the next one's quite similar, similar to the previous point around really important to take the business on the journey with you. So your colleagues almost certainly have ideas and can support you and can more effectively embed the changes throughout the organisation. They can also share your aspirations and achievements with clients and other external stakeholders. So one key thing that we'd say is to start the journey now. So you can see by how our own journey, we've really grown and evolved over time, and we've certainly learned a lot along the way as well. So it really is just great to make the first step and just start moving. One big takeaway that I'd suggest is just being really transparent with your auditor, no matter what stage you're at. So many companies, especially when we talk around Scope 3 emissions, are really on a learning curve. And you might not get it right always the first time, but being transparent with your auditor and recognising where you have your own areas to improve will help them sort of have the confidence that you're taking it seriously and that you are looking for areas of improvement as well. So finally, use this as an opportunity to strengthen your organisation. The audit process will produce findings and it'll include opportunities for improvement as well, many of which you might not have even considered before. So you really can learn and grow from this entire experience, and it's fair to say that we certainly have at Mott MacDonald. So thank you for listening to the presentation.
So my name is Dan. I'm with the aerospace team in here in London with LRQA. And just to round out our webinar today, I wanted to talk a little bit about some projects, case studies in particular in our team are in aviation. and airport and infrastructure is a key one. So essentially, the reason we look at this at the moment is that the aviation industry is reducing its impact on climate change. It has internationally accepted net zero carbon goal of 2050, and aviation infrastructure accounts for a part of that. Overall, aviation as a whole, including all the aircraft flying and so on, accounts for about 2 to 3% of global carbon emissions. But airport infrastructure is a subset of that, and it's very important that we look at managing and mitigating greenhouse gas emissions at that infrastructure level. So if I move on to the next slide, I think the first step that we look at, and this is where LRQA can certainly help clients as well, is to provide an overall view of the sorts of drivers, directives that form the reasons for having a greenhouse gas emissions mitigation plan. They might be driven by some of these regional or international climates change acts or Clean Air Acts, both in the UK, the US, the EU, and more wider. They might be in response to restrictions on energy, tariffs, sanctions. They might just be nice to have standards that are increasingly calling in a consideration of sustainability. The new ISO 9001s, the AS 9100s in the aviation industry, those sorts of standards will be looking at sustainable operations and ways to enhance operations in line with climate directives and requirements. So LRQA mapping of the drivers is certainly a key activity that we do. My team, we also work with companies to look at the emissions reductions strategies. But one of the three key steps to assessing your first steps in that process, particularly from an airport point of view, is the cultural buy-in. The reasoning, the senior management teams need to have an understanding and a really good in-depth understanding of why we need to embark on such an activity. You know, the core benefit is always going to be improvements in operations, because most actions that reduce emissions have benefits, whether it's in cost, electricity usage, greenhouse gas outputs, from all the efficiencies that are going to result therein, improved processes, water, waste management, all of those things translate into financial savings. But of course, there are wider benefits at the cultural level we need to understand, and that's key in making the case for a greenhouse gas strategy. They can be to do with branding, public relations, resilience in the face of market prices for carbon going up, carbon offsets challenges, employee health and relations, and many other benefits. Of course, jumped ahead there for a second, sorry. Technical feasibility is a key aspect as well. We need to understand where the biggest contributors are in our own airport operations, the scope 1s, the scope 2 emissions. They can consist of all the off-site generation, if you're talking about scope 2, your electricity, your heating, your cooling that's purchased, or it can include the here and now, the scope 1s, the emissions that are really under the direct control of the airport operator. Again, that can be heating and electricity, but it can be ground vehicles, it can be the ramps, it can be all sorts of infrastructure that's immediately under the control of the airport. So the key thing is to understand those, to make the case at the cultural level, and to set your goals that are meaningful and achievable in light of those studies and understandings. So for us, that forms the first step really of a LRQA plan to deliver a carbon reduction roadmap. The first step being mapping. Of course, this beyond the scope of this webinar are the next steps: the reduction, the optimization of operations, and eventually the neutrality. But for our 4-step strategy that we implement with clients, this webinar concerns just the first one. And in this case study, quite a bit of text here to look at, but essentially it's about taking the clients through these steps. The cultural buy-in we've talked about, setting the scope. There's certain frameworks that in the airport case study, we would look at. What are the directives? We already talked about some of those. Are there any particular aviation specific frameworks? Well, there are. There's the Airport Council framework, which is very much in line with international standards like the GHG protocols. What tools we have to support that. These can be software tools. A big one is ACERT in the aviation and airports industry. It's a tool that allows us to really take an inventory of all the various scopes, 1, 2, and 3. And that would be the next step, to identify carbon emission sources. So as we've already touched on, scope 3, incidentally, which is obviously one of the most difficult types to assess and categorize, is increasingly under scrutiny. So there's no getting away from it. And LRQA's teams on the ground, our supply chain assurance programs, we can really support clients in having that upstream and downstream transparency of the supply chain and how it relates to sustainability and the directives therein. We then progress to the next steps, which are the calculation of emissions and carbon footprints. These can range in the airport case study. They range from aircraft, passenger movements, terminal and cargo operation and movements in the airport, taxiing, auxiliary power units by aircraft, so onboard generators, time spent running engines, airport and airline tenants at the airports, their vehicles and buildings. We really look at every aspect of an operation, including the de-icing fluids. Of course, the other typical utilities, corporate travel, travel by staff, how that can fit in to the frameworks and our goals is something that we look at as well. And finally, the reporting. The reporting is something that LRQA have a lot of experience in, because we get involved with verifications of reporting, and so we can work with clients to make sure that the data is good. Where you need third parties, independent appraisals of data, we can get involved in that, and look at a range of reporting frameworks and requirements and tools to do so. The final slide will be an example of a report that we can help you produce, which is a look at your airport greenhouse gas emissions inventory. This is using a software tool called ACERT. Again, I mentioned earlier, it's widely becoming widely used in aviation infrastructure projects for greenhouse gas emissions inventory and management. And it's a tool that has a very, very user-friendly interface, as long as you have very good operational data, which we can help you achieve and refine. As long as we can utilize that, we are able to produce reports that will be aligned with frameworks and facilitate your reporting. You have there some examples of the types of greenhouse gas emissions, the sources, the scopes they fall into, how they're broken down. And of course, these will enable you to target your next step on that ladder that I showed you earlier, target your next steps into the biggest culprits, and then refine that going forward. So this is an example of the report, but if you have any questions, we'll be glad to take them after this session. Otherwise, thank you for listening, and I hope that you found the session interesting, and we'll move on to the poll. Thank you, Dan.
Our second poll question today. Will your organisation be looking for any of the following services in the next 12 months? So the options here are greenhouse gas emissions verification, product carbon footprint verification, sector-specific emissions verification, carbon reduction projects, similar to the one that Dan has just taken you through, or environmental and energy management system certification. So please select any that supply, and those options again: greenhouse gas emissions verification, project carbon footprint verification, sector-specific emissions verification, carbon reduction projects, or environmental and energy management systems certification. So thank you for responding. Let's have a quick look at those. So quite a spread there. So that's great. And if we can just move to the final poll question for today, so we can move over to the Q&A. Our final question today is to gauge interest in some new ISO 14064 training courses that will be launching very soon. So would your organisation be looking for any of the following training courses in the next 12 months? So we have an introduction to ISO 14064, ISO 14064-1 implementation and verification, and we also offer customised training programs. So if any of those would be of interest to you, it'd be great to gauge that. Those options again: introduction to ISO 14064, ISO 14064-1 implementation and verification, and lastly, customized training programs. So thank you very much for participating in our polls today. We'll now move on to the Q&A section. Thank you to everybody who's submitted their questions already. Let's get started. So Olga, we'll start with you. Can you share some insights into the specific challenges and benefits of aligning an organisation with ISO 14068 to achieve carbon neutrality?
Yes. This standard aims to provide clear definitions and requirements for CO2 neutrality for organizations, products, and, for example, also events. The standard called the organization, the products, or the events are the subject to be neutralized. The first thing should be measured. It's measured, for example, for organization, it is recommended to use ISO 14064-1, or for product 67. This is the first step. And later it is requested a management plan that the requirements of the management plan are very useful, are very good, is very complete, and defines how will be the roadmap to achieve these zero emissions. In the second place, you should have a reduction emission plan with periodical monitoring and at least the offsetting. So ISO 14068 is a roadmap for companies to embark on the journey toward achieving net zero emissions. It's a very good standard.
Great, thank you, Olga. So Dan, we'll come to you next. So they're interested in case study relating to the emissions reduction at airports. Could you elaborate on the strategies and results achieved in this context, please?
Yeah, of course, thank you. So some of the sorts of strategies that are implemented really arise as a result of that mapping and measuring that we talked about earlier, and the report that comes out of that. The examples that come to mind are really off the back of perhaps if they've found areas for energy efficiency that could be at the building or infrastructure level. You know, one airport, I think last year or the year before, was the first one in the world to have new types of window panes installed that reflect sun's radiation, so that helps keep the building cool. Another one optimized energy through lighting and LED upgrades. Of course, these are some of the more basic approaches to improving lighting and saving in kilowatt hours, and translating into delivering tons of carbon savings. Of course, there's the heating and cooling aspect. We have one airport that in Hong Kong that implemented a predictive way to conduct the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and so on systems based on weather forecasts. So they had a smart system that links to weather forecasts, passenger numbers, and so on. So quite an advanced system there. So you have these basic, infrastructure level, insulation, and so on, up to more advanced predictive analytic approaches. And one final one would be renewable energy consumption. So there's a lot of work that we can facilitate and assist in looking at direct purchase agreements of renewable energy, and helping identify the best way to use solar, or sources of solar and wind energy. And one airport, I think it was in New Zealand, pioneered the use of innovative ground source heat pumps, which they didn't even know they could use to enhance that region's decarbonisation. So there are a range of options based on the reports, based on the measures, and they can range in complexity right down to the ground operations, air traffic management, terminals, vehicles, waste management, and of course offsetting of carbon emissions and programs to facilitate that.
Thank you, Dan. Bethan, we'll come to you next. In your experience, how does PAS 2080 help you to calculate emissions reduction related to infrastructure projects, and what advantages has it brought to Mott MacDonald?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think first of all, it's just worth noting that PAS 2080 is around much more than just emissions assessment. So it really is about carbon management as a whole. So PAS 2080 does, of course, include measurement, tools monitoring, reporting, but it's part of a wider sort of system and framework. So I think going through the process ourselves, so external verification to PAS 2080 every year, we really try and do focus on this, have an emphasis on continual improvement. So this means that we really learn something each year about the areas that we can improve upon and develop to help support our clients with their decarbonisation journeys. I think a good example for us would be our digital decarbonisation tool, which is the Master Carbon Portal. So we do ask our verifier every year so that tool is scrutinised as part of the process. This really helps us just develop our own confidence and also the confidence of our clients that this tool is producing accurate results, and it also helps us develop new functionalities also.
Thank you, Bethan. We'll stick with you if that's okay. Lots of interest in the case study that you shared with us. So, how did you get the data for your Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for Scope 3, we report on 7 different Scope 3 categories. So each of those different categories, we collect our data from various different sources. So purchase goods and services, for example, is a huge portion of our pie for Scope 3 emissions. So at the moment, we do have quite a high level assessment based on spend. So we use a spend-based emission factor in order to estimate those emissions. And as part of our carbon reduction plan, you saw one of our key steps is really working with how we can better engage with suppliers to get more granularity on those emissions. Just as another example, employee commute seems to be another challenging one for businesses like ours. So what we do is send out an annual employee commute survey, which we can use to estimate and extrapolate emissions as well. Yeah, I could go into lots of detail on all of the different ones, but I think hopefully we can leave it there.
You mentioned commuter behaviour just then, and we've actually had a couple of questions about that. So I wonder if there's a way, in addition to sending out that report, that you influence behaviour of your colleagues.
Yeah, so I think in general, sort of what I've spoken about in my presentation around sort of leadership support and comms across the organisation, I think is a really key one for us. So we like to think that a lot of our colleagues are sort of aware of what we're trying to achieve as an organisation. So alongside our group carbon reduction plan, we operate globally, so we have various regional carbon reduction plans. So I think for employee commute, developing locally tailored actions is going to be really key, because what might work in one place may not work in another place. So each of our regions are in the process, and it's fair to say we are very much early on in our stages of employee commute, for example. So each of our regions are reaching out to their local areas to understand how they might better encourage low carbon commute in their areas. One of the things that we've already started to implement, for example, is working on our benefits exchanges as part of the company. So whether we can provide annual passes as part of the public transport passes, as part of a benefits exchange, EVs, for example. So there are a few different things, but I think it's really important that it's a localized approach, especially for employee commute.
Thank you, Bethan. Olga, we've had somebody ask, so Sharon's asked, I've never understood why employee commuting is scope 3, as the company can fund and subsidise initiatives, as Bethan's just been talking about, to mitigate it, set policy to work from home and other steps. What's the rationale behind employee commuting being a scope 3 emission? Are you able to shed any light on that?
Yes, in the scope 3 are, let's say, all the emissions that you cannot completely control or own. And you can have some influence. In the scope 3 are the emissions that you can influence. So they are included there because not all, there are companies, for example, that they have their own transport to go to the place, but there are a lot of companies that cannot do it in this way. For this reason, I think that I won't not in the writing of the standard, but I think that the point is because it's an influential situation, not always a control situation. For this reason, I think that is in the scope 3.
Thank you. And while we're on scope 3 emissions, staying with you, Olga, what are the key questions to ask suppliers when trying to understand their emissions and targets to help lower scope 3 emissions? That's a question from James.
Yes, the important point it is to focus on the emission factor of the product or services, and in the quantity, and how to make a long-term collaboration in order to make this reduction. So let's say that it's not so important to know if they have a system or if they are working on that, or the specific details about the decarbonization plan. It is more important, in my opinion, to focus on the product or service that they are delivering you, and how to reduce the emissions associated with this product or service.
Thank you. Dan, if we can come to you, I've had a question from Michael. So he says, currently the UK doesn't have infrastructure in place to enable a quick transition to net zero. Are the net zero targets realistic or aspirational at the moment? Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Thank you. Of course, they are aspirational, but when you're looking at the different sectors, they become more realistic once you start to understand how the supply chain works. And one of the things we see is increasing nearshoring of supply chains. So in areas of industry where supply chains have been very globalized, yes, the goals might be a bit more aspirational, but as suppliers and procurement managers start to pull in supply chains and bring them closer to shore, reduce the distances traveled, reduce complexity in the supply chain, it's actually not so unrealistic anymore. And you're right, the UK infrastructure, which is a very globalized supply chain, which has a very globalized supply chain, does suffer in some areas in that respect. But more and more leaders in certain sectors, particularly those relying on the Far East, more and more of those are starting to look at nearer sources in line with these aspirations and goals.
Thank you, Dan. I think we've got time just for one last question. So we've had a question from Rex, who's asked, the STBI seems aimed at large companies. What certification would you recommend as a starting point for a small company to be able to work towards net zero? Olga, would you like to take that one?
Okay, the majority of the companies start with the ISO 14064 Part 1 because let's say that includes all the requirements of the calculation of a carbon footprint, supported by the guidance of the ESG protocol. There are a lot of companies that start looking at the scope 1 and scope 2, that they are more confident, or for example, including some information about business travel in the first attempt, and later they go with this standard to the scope 3. And as you said, when all this is well set up, they can go to the CDP or a science-based target, but the basis, it is the ISO 14064 Part 1.
Thank you, Olga. I'm afraid we've reached the top of the hour, so I'd like to end by thanking our panel and to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you could complete that and provide your feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email within the next few days with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. So on behalf of LRQA and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.